This is Open Line on the VOCM Big Land FM radio network.
Welcome back to the program. A curious email during the newscast asking for me to justify why there was not designation for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada to put the review of the World Energy GH2 proposal in under the federal lens, and of course triggering intervener status and whatnot. I'm not so sure why it's up to me to justify what someone else did, but I did take the opportunity after reading the email to find the decision that was offered by the Minister's office. So it was specifically about World Energy GH2, the 41 hectares and the 30-year operations of the 164 wind turbines. Okay, it says basically the decision, this project does not warrant designation. This not my words, these are Minister Guilbeault's words. Reasons. Pursuant to Section 9 of the Impact Assessment Act, I, Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, considered the potential for the project to cause adverse effects within federal jurisdiction, adverse direct or incidental effects, and public concerns related to these effects, as well as the adverse impacts on Indigenous peoples. In forming my opinion, I took into account the analysis prepared by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. By the way, I have these documents on hand if anyone's interested in reading them. He says, I am of the opinion that the designation of the project is unwarranted for the following reasons. The legislative process that currently applies to the project and related consultations with potentially impacted Indigenous peoples provides a framework to address the potential adverse aforementioned effects and concerns raised by peoples and members of the general public. These processes include the ongoing provincial environmental assessment in accordance with the Newfoundland and Labrador's Environmental Protection Act, in which Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Transport Canada, and Health Canada participate as federal experts. It's interesting that it makes direct reference to all the federal legislation, but doesn't warrant any federal oversight. Okay. Provincial licenses, permits, approvals, and reporting requirements that may be required for the project pursuant to the Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, federal, Water Resources Act, federal, the Management of Greenhouse Gas Act, federal, and federal authorizations, approvals, and reporting requirements that may be required under the Fisheries Act, federal, Species at Risk Act, federal, Migratory Birds Act, Convention Act of 1994, federal, Canadian Environmental Protection Act of 1999, federal, the Canadian Navigable Waters Act, federal, and the Canada Shipping Act of 2001, also federal. It goes on to say, the project must be carried out in compliance with federal and provincial legislation, including the Fisheries Act, the Environmental Protection Act, and all the aforementioned. So that was the rationale offered by the federal government. So I'm not really sure how anybody thinks that I should or could or would or want to justify that decision. You know, some of that I think is maybe based on a call we had yesterday from Mike. He's one of the people with Protect NL. And talking about whether or not we think or anybody thinks that if there's a change in hands at the federal government level, that the Conservative Party would trigger some sort of stop to this particular project. I don't know. I've certainly not heard anything from the federal Conservatives that indicates that they would stop any of these types of projects and impose federal jurisdiction on these particular matters. I think it also begs the question whether or not people want that to be the case. You know, more often than not, people think that provincial jurisdiction should be maintained. And the federal government has been taken to task on a variety of fronts in the recent past about federal government overreach. You know, a couple of notables come to mind. The whole designating plastics as a toxic substance and, of course, waste management is provincial. And so the Supreme Court said, no, that it's not up to the federal government to implement those types of policies and those types of designations because the province is responsible for dealing with their own waste product. That just pops something into my mind, too, about the disposal of medical waste, which was a pretty hot-button topic there for a little while. In fact, the proponent who's put forward a proposal here for Lewisport, right? Yeah. Lewisport no, it's not. It's in Mount Pearl, it's in Lewisport. To have a treatment facility, a disposal facility, because we currently do dispose of medical waste, and we're not importing medical waste from elsewhere, just dealing with what we have. Apparently his approach, technologically speaking, because after that call and what he'd mentioned, what they were intending to do, I put it out to people who were much smarter than me, and they said that's about the best process available. Then they talked about the transportation and the eventual disposal, and not only all the tech that he was providing, but also the costs associated with it. So it went from people really quite worried. Oh, they were also worried about proximity to businesses and what have you. He sent along very detailed drawings about where the facility currently is and its proximity to other businesses, warehouses and otherwise, and then juxtaposed his proposal, which is a little further away than what we're currently doing out in Donovan's. So that was a big topic for a while. And some of the worries was, are we going to be importing other people's medical waste? The short answer is no. That's very much akin to, of course, Lewisport back in the conversation, where there was a company that had really not gotten off the ground, got any traction anywhere else in the world, regarding importing other people's garbage and doing some sort of transformative process to recycle it. And, of course, the government kind of kicked it around. The proposal really was very sunshiny. And we looked around at other places, including Las Vegas, where they had made similar proposals, and it got shot down. The government shot it down here because they referred back to a 1994 decision from then Premier Clyde Wells about pretty much saying that it was illegal to import other people's garbage for any type of purpose, including the one being proposed out in Lewisport. So those three. That's the document that came from the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change regarding World Energy GH2. Number two is the whole concept of the medical waste proposal that is currently being considered by the provincial government, and the project that got shot down in Lewisport. This is a number of years ago. I'm going to say off the top of my head, this is maybe 2017, 2018, somewhere in that neighborhood, where those conversations were happening. Let's check in on the Twitter box. We're VOCM up online, follow us there. And referring back to an issue regarding Gonzaga, and Councillor Tom Davis was on the show talking about just how tricky and dangerous it can be there. Immediately, a listener, a mother of a child that goes to Gonzaga, said exactly the same thing. Of course, there's some, it's not to say that plenty of adults aren't heavy-footed on the loud pedal, but having lived in that area, it is really quite clear that there's a lot of drag racing to get out of the parking lot first. That takes place, and then consequently to get out of the area, get out of the neighborhood. And if you've ever been on Smithville Crescent, of course, it's a crescent, but getting onto Long Pond Road, if you go down past the church towards St. Pius X, or what do they call it now, Rennie's River, it's just basically a lot of merging. The stop sign is widely ignored, and so it can present a pretty tricky piece of navigation right there in that area. So Katie thinks exactly what Tom said. We're also receiving your emails. It's openline at VOCM.com. When we come back, let's have a great next segment that requires your participation. Another quick tweet here. Aaron says, I think part of the problem on an impact assessment agency and wind energy is that it's difficult to show that the wind energy is more harmful than ATV and snowmobile use in rural areas, or the harm of driving vehicles. Yes, wind energy has harms, but it seems low compared to other activities. But it's the footprint issue that I think would be in contrast to references to ATVs and snowmobiles. We are talking about a significant percentage of the Port-au-Port Peninsula to now be the home of the 164 wind turbines if the project actually gets off the ground. Still some looming questions there, I would suggest. A variety of reasons. The Germans think the end product of green hydrogen is expensive. Not because I say so, because they say so. They've set aside €1.2 billion to help offset the cost for their end consumer. In addition to that, again, these are numbers coming from government, not from me. They had a forecast of the value of the global hydrogen industry some 4 years ago. They said it'd be worth $11.9 trillion by mid-century. 4 years later, they've downplayed that forecast to a value of the global hydrogen industry to be $1.9 trillion by mid-century. So is it going to be a thing of the future? Maybe. I don't have a crystal ball. But for folks who are looking at it at Natural Resources Canada, they are not quite as bullish on it as they were some short 4 years ago. So there's some other things to consider. In addition to that, raising the capital looks to be problematic for some of these organizations. Now, World Energy GH2 is a much bigger company than simply what the proposal entails out on the West Coast, because, of course, they have massive operations and expansion of operations for biodiesel in California in particular. So they've got a business track record. And, of course, when you're backed by a fellow like John Risley, who, of course, has had business successes in the past and is, has a pretty enormous wealth himself, so maybe they'll have a different opportunity than others. But, of course, the traditional lenders, or any lender, unless the federal government assigns a firm definition to see what kind of level of subsidy might be available, because it's between 15% and 40%, to compare. In Nova Scotia, if they have to interact with the public grid, which they will, they've got something like 58% of the power is generated by coal and coke. In this province, we are well in excess of 80% from renewables. So we would have a different tax subsidy for proponents here if they're successful, if they get off the ground, if they can raise the capital. I think that's just going to be different set of circumstances based on if I'm Goldman Sachs, I need to know exactly what the model entails as opposed to guessing what the feds may indeed assign as a definition of whatever constitutes green in their mind. And nothing's perfectly green. Things are greener than others. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're speaking with you. Don't go away.